on today's IT Roundtable, we're talking about protecting the enterprise, including handling challenges with network visibility and guarding against ransomware attacks. To discuss that, I'm joined by three industry experts. With me is Dan Krantz, Chief Information Officer at Keysight Technologies. Dan, good to have you on the panel today.
Good to be here, James. Hi, everybody.
Also with me is Mark Pierpoint, President of Network Applications and Security at Keysight Technologies. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion today.
And rounding out our panel is Charlie Ballum, Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Cloud Ingenuity. Hello to you, Charlie. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
All right, so I think it's interesting. We've seen networks become more software-defined and flexible with the adoption of SD-WAN, edge computing, multi-cloud. So what new challenges does this bring to achieving end-to-end network visibility while also optimizing the performance of monitoring and security tools? And how will these challenges be addressed? Charlie, your view on this?
Yeah, obviously we're having a lot of these conversations with customers today, and I think anytime you look to modernize and transform your environment with things like SD-WAN, et cetera, you're adding complexity, right? So a lot of our customers are saying, you know, we're doing all of these things, but we're losing visibility, and we're having those conversations around, as you plan for this transformation and modernization, you should at the same time be thinking about proactively, am I building an architecture that will allow me to retain that visibility? If I'm moving in, to cloud or a hybrid environment, for example, do I have the infrastructure in place that allows me to have the same visibility, the same control, the same access that I had previously? So it's definitely a challenge as you modernize, you tend to add complexity. And I think you need to think ahead in your design and your architecture to be able to achieve that.
Mark, what's your take on addressing these challenges?
Yeah, I think Charlie's summed up the challenge. The interesting piece that we've seen across a number of our customers is that as you move into these virtualized environments, the access to some of the data that you'd really like to be able to tap into becomes more difficult. And I think it's always a challenge to balance, cost versus the amount of data you want to collect. Today, it's very easy, for example, to be able to deploy virtual probes out into the network that you have. Then the challenge comes more to how do you manage and orchestrate those and not overwhelm your existing network with the data that's coming back from those probes. So I think Charlie summed it up. It's really a delicate balance between how much visibility you want versus the business challenges or the business prerogatives that you have.
Dan, your view on these challenges? What would you add?
Yeah, there's a human element to this that is unfolding for us at Keysight. We've been doing a massive re-architecture of our network to go software defined and put in much more sophisticated monitoring, and taking some of our traditional network engineering talent and reskilling them to be able to do automation at scale with low code monitoring tools and platforms. That's been a part of the journey that kind of caught us by surprise, to be able to anticipate that there's actually a skills element to this that we've got to factor into building out the monitoring infrastructure and getting those network engineers that are really comfortable just kind of being hands-on keyboard on the individual networking devices to actually think holistically and think about software and kind of go in that new direction.
Yeah, you hit on something that is kind of near and dear to our heart there, and that is automation, right? Every engagement we work on with a customer, it's not just about deploying these new latest and greatest technologies, but it's also looking, at every angle, where can I look to automate so that, again, some of the complexity that I'm adding doesn't now become, workload on top of the people that I have in place. So it's very encouraging to hear you say that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the key for us is we like to use the word templatization. I don't know if that actually can be looked up in a dictionary, but basically a rinse and repeat, to say, rather than customize every single installation, every device, every component, every monitoring tool, can you templatize it and then push that out at scale through automation, and getting our network engineering team to think that different way at scale. That's been a fun journey for us the last couple of years.
Well, I think that IT professionals will tell you that network security and monitoring tools are only as good as the data they receive. So how does sending the right data to the right tools help maintain consistent quality of service and accelerate problem resolution? Dan, what's your insight into this?
Yeah, I can tell you that we've been on this maturity curve, as I was talking about. We started at what I would call a level 0, the canary in the coal mine approach to network monitoring, which is no monitoring, having just humans, basically eyes on glass. And most of the canaries were our end users telling us, your network is slow, your network is down. That's not the way to run a network at scale. And so, we've kind of gone through several steps to level 1, where you put in some basic health status at the component level, to level 2, sort of an integrated monitoring of your holistic network. What we're working on now is level 3, the real user experience, and being able to correlate at the system level what we see in the network monitoring data with what we see in our application performance data, and that correlation. And the holy grail where we're headed is level 4, predictive, trying to actually get ahead of the curve. And so none of that, levels 1 through 4, are possible with the wrong data. And having the right instrumentation in our network, feeding the data, and then just building on it on that particular journey. And for us, the key measure that we've been honing in on from ever since we tried to get out of the canary in the coal mine approach to network operations was MTTR, mean time to resolution, and being able to just measure the crispness and quickness with which we are addressing any kind of issue. So again, having the right data is the only way to drive down your MTTR. And I'd love to get our MTTR to a negative number, which means we're addressing problems before they even showed up on anyone's radar screen.
Actually predicting the problems ahead of time.
That's where I want to get to. Yeah, and we're starting to use some machine learning, some AI to try to take a look at some of the sort of the health data, no issues yet, but just sort of leading indicators from your network infrastructure that give you an indication that when we've seen that pattern in the past, soon thereafter, we start to see a performance degradation or an outage. And so can we actually find the leading indicators before there's actually a problem? So that's where we're starting to wrestle with some of the challenges today. And it's all about having the right data in order to do that.
Yeah, James, I think what Dan's really talking about is a shift that we've seen across the industry over the last couple of years, really, which is moving from a passive approach to data collection to more of a proactive approach. And it's pretty important. We'll talk a bit more about that, I'm sure. But to actually go in and understand where you've got some gaps, you need to actually synthesize data, typical traffic information, insert that into the network. And not just rely on the fact that you're going to be able to pick up some problem by monitoring the traffic that occurs every day. I think the only other thing I would say to back up what Dan has said is back to the kind of the people side of this, is inevitably in any of these discussions, you can't separate the people from the process. And therefore the training and the repeatability with which you address issues is really important to address that MTTR metric that Dan mentioned. So practice is a really vital piece. And so I would say there's really 2 key things that we're delivering today. Number 1 is being able to do exactly what you said, get the right data to the right tools. Often this is a matter of data compression and how do you find that needle in the haystack, as well as inserting synthetic data in so that you can find problems before they occur. And then the other piece is providing a framework for which customers can actually practice. You can simulate an attack of whatever nature, whatever sort, and then test your team's response to that. And in a couple of cases with customers, we've seen where they've gone from floundering around for an hour or 2, wondering how to address this, really down to a much more sophisticated approach where they're on point addressing the issues and making progress on those issues within a matter of minutes versus hours.
Charlie, what would you add about maintaining quality of service?
Well, what's interesting is, I went on a little, I'll call it a tour of getting to speak with quite a few CISOs through different events. And, you talk about AI, you talk about detections and all the things that you think they'd want to hear about. And every single one of them started with visibility. They started with, we still don't have the visibility, the hygiene that we need. And I don't want to say the term that you see out there all over LinkedIn and whatnot nowadays, but the reality is I can't secure or monitor what I can't see. And it sounds so simple, but it happens in every scenario. And it always, we'll work with customers on a solution, and they'll have a problem, and it's almost always not, hey, the tool or the solution or the team missed it. It's a gap in visibility. I mean, it's very common. And again, as we said in the previous question, as I add more complexity and things like segmentation and SD-WAN, I'm only making that challenge harder. So I think it's something that our customers are telling us is top of mind is, do I have gaps? Do I have, things that are missing? And, especially after, things like the Colonial issue that they had, et cetera, it's now a federal mandate to know, where do I have gaps? Where do I need better visibility? So I think it's a big challenge, and we're having a lot of discussions with our customers around how to address that. And it also comes into, and I think Mark was alluding to this as well, is there's also ideally, yes, I'd like to have a virtual tap across my entire environment, right? But it also comes down to, what's the best bang for my buck, and how do I get the best visibility that's also practical, and then looking at the risk of having the coverage and not having that coverage. So these are very top of mind conversations that we're having almost daily, frankly.
So certainly those blind spots are a major problem, and blind spots that result from not collecting the right data can have major ramifications that go beyond IT, way beyond. So what impacts have you seen from blind spots on businesses that you've worked with? Mark, what's been your experience?
Well, I think, as we, to pick up kind of some of the threads here, blind spots can come from many different places. And it's probably also worth talking a little bit about when we say, what's the right data? What are we talking about? And from that, I think we can then kind of get back to the question of what are the impacts of that. Well, clearly, as Charlie just mentioned, there's always a consideration of how much do you want to spend? I mean, nobody has an infinite budget. And ultimately, you could argue that to collect all the data and bring it and see everything is essentially going to cost you an infinite amount of money. So there has to be some trade-off in terms of cost versus risk. When it comes to data, though, what we've seen is a shifting, traditionally visibility was delivered and still is in a lot of cases through monitoring of packet information, right down at the raw traffic that's moving across the network. But increasingly, people have been looking to other forms of data. So logs, for example, that come from any type of network element or server or anything else within the network. And then ultimately for applications, more than anything else, then various forms of metadata are just increasing ways to, if you like, compress information and only pass what you need. Unfortunately, no one of these collects everything, right? Or gives you that visibility that Dan was talking about earlier, all the way from the application down to the network and how it's experienced or is experienced by the user. And so, what we've really been working on is trying to find ways to link those different aspects down through the various layers of the network so that essentially you can reduce these blind spots. Now, in terms of the impact, I mean, clearly the biggest one is all around reducing surprises. Nobody likes surprises. Charlie mentioned the Colonial Pipeline situation, but I think it's probably daily that we see some kind of breach or some kind of issue that came out. And it's not just affecting big multinational companies these days, but affecting relatively small businesses. In fact, down in the LA area, There's essentially a business that sells barbecues, right? That recently got hacked. And while we're not talking about millions of dollars, they're probably only talking about a few $100,000. The relative impact on the business is significant, just in terms of risk to the business. So I think that's one. And without going much further, I think, maybe Dan, I know you and I have talked about a number of these, and you've probably got some other examples of where lack of information or lack of data, this insight, really prevents customers from, or prevents companies in general from responding quickly enough and being in a position where they just don't know what's happened for a while, where to go to fix the problem and how to do it. And it may be an application issue, but often than not, it's somewhere else in their system as well.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that, Mark. From a lesson learned from when we were at level 0 in our network monitoring, the canary in the coal mine approach, where we didn't have much instrumentation. And we're a defense contractor, so we do sell product and solutions into the U.S. government. And we received one of those calls you don't want to receive from the government, which is, hello, I'm from the intelligence community, and I have some indicators of compromise pertaining to you as one of our suppliers. We can't tell you how we have this information or why, but we need you to do something about it. That was a wake-up call. That was to find the answer, to find the indicators of compromise. These are hashes that you want to try to find in your environment without the right instrumentation. Took us well over 6 months and well over $1 million of consulting fees to try to get that puzzle solved. But more important than that was the threat of loss of business, the inability to continue to serve our customers in the US government, because if we're not able to answer that inquiry, we're not able to continue to be a supplier. So fast forward, now we've instrumented our network. We still get the occasional, we can't tell you how we know this, but we have this hash. Could you go look it up? And we're responding within minutes because we've got the data. And it's tapered off significantly the amount of inquiries we're getting from our customers on that regard. So when you had the blind spot, the complete threat to the loss of business, in addition to the expenses to mitigate it, to now it's actually an advantage to say, we're a trusted partner. You can trust us. We've instrumented our network going forward.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, your thoughts on blind spots and their impacts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stories you just heard are great examples. We've seen it both in security. Heck, I've seen it in things as simple as, doing an application move, right? Where, we'll be working with a customer and they said they were moving an application, they're moving it into the cloud, and all of a sudden they have a massive outage in the middle of the day because they didn't know, oh, this database is a part of this application, right? So it sounds simple, but again, back to the original question with the complexities and segmentation and things that you have in play, again, knowing what needs to be migrated, what dependencies do I have, on the IT operations side, that's of interest. And then on security, it's even more so, right? I mean, we have a lot of conversations similar to what Mark was talking about around foundationally from a security perspective, do I have a core interesting points of data? So in our approach, it's, do I have logs? Do I have some sort of endpoints or agents? And then do I have network data? And if I've got, those 3 core levels, I've got a pretty good view into my environment, and then I can start to layer, and you heard Dan talk about this earlier, layering AI and machine learning on top of that. We do the same thing, but it's all starts from a foundation of, do I have good data sets? Because, the biggest trend that we see and that we're talking with customers, specifically on the security side, is the days of putting up enough walls and preventing a breach, those are over. It's really about, do I have the ability to understand and respond quickly so that I can reduce the impact? Trying to say that, I'm going to go to my board and I'm a CISO and I'm going to promise you that, we're never going to get breached is a career limiting move, right? It's more about, do I have the things in place? Do I have the segmentation in place so that when somebody does get in, I've got the protection to not have them move laterally, to know about it before they start taking things off the network? And it all comes down to exactly what you're talking about, which is, do I have gaps, right? And, we see some interesting scenarios because, you get on the topic of patching and updates, right? Those are easy. Those should be done. But, you get into healthcare, you get into oil and gas, you get into SCADA networks. I can promise you there's areas of the network that they just absolutely cannot patch and upgrade. So then it's, well, what am I doing? Well, then I'm using network segmentation, et cetera, to make sure that I've at least walled off that environment. So it's a very popular topic. As we said, we're having a lot more conversations around it since the federal mandate and the Colonial incident.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about security breaches and ransomware. And how do you think IT can better prepare for the increasing number of security breaches, especially ransomware attacks, which have just exploded over the last year or so? Dan, your view on this?
Yeah, I'll tell you, James, what we've done is we've actually spun up a formal ransomware resiliency program.
Hmm.
Kind of like what Charlie was talking about. You don't assume that your defenses are perfect. You kind of have to assume that it's going to hit me someday. So the 5 ingredients of our ransomware resiliency programs are this. Number one, we started with trying to select the most critical processes that matter to us. You can't be resilient everywhere. So you got to pick the critical few. And for us at Keysight in our internal operations, we said it's two process areas, the quote to cash process, and then the identity and access management process. So step one is we pick 2 areas. These are critical to us, and we're going to do ransomware resiliency in it. And then step 2 is mapping out the systems and infrastructure that comprise those process flows. Step 3 was then looking at the 3 dimensions of security. Number 1, the ability to do backups and restores of those systems. Number 2, the security defenses, the segmentation, the firewalling, all of the defensive posture. And then number 3, the health of the monitoring of that environment, having the ongoing visibility. So that's our 3rd step, is getting those 3 dimensions of security. Then the 4th step, and the one we're at right now, is running a tabletop exercise with our teams to just see, how do all of these ingredients work? No training, no mitigation, just right off out of the gate. How are we doing? So that's where we're at today. After we finish that, we're going to have a lot of lessons learned. We'll do some mitigations, corrections, improvements. Then we're going to run another tabletop exercise, this one proctored by an outside firm who can come in and really simulate the stresses, the human side of when you are under attack and the pressure is on. People don't necessarily behave at their best. That's where we're going to really see the rubber meet the road and see how it all works. And then we'll just rinse and repeat and do this tabletop exercise, mitigate, rerun the tabletop exercise. That's I think what everybody's got to be thinking about for ransomware resiliency.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, how can we be better prepared?
I think a lot of the things Dan hit on, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, it goes back to the foundation of, do I have the right data? Do I have gaps? And then a big thing that we preach is, a lot of the industry tried to go after ransomware with, more of a signature-based approach, which it's evolving and changing so fast that is not the way to do it. And then, then the question becomes, okay, then how should I try to go after this problem? And to us, in working with some of our partners, we preach an approach of having network data and making sure I don't have any gaps. But then, instead of trying to look for the versions, like, is this WannaCry, is this Petya, we're more looking for the symptoms of ransomware. Instead of trying to keep up and try and catch, this is XYZ flavor and et cetera, which is going to be a never ending battle because it's constantly evolving. We're watching for things on the network that would cue me in that, hey, this device all of a sudden is doing a whole lot more from a storage perspective than it normally is. Or, things like, I can see a ransomware note on the wire, like I can pull that data off of my network. That's really where we're working with customers to take again, you heard earlier talking about being proactive, take a proactive approach and start to look for the symptoms that show up on my network when I have ransomware, instead of trying to just catch, this signature does this signature does that. And we found that to be very effective. We do a lot of work with higher ed and ISDs and state and local institutions, and they've been under high attack with ransomware. You're now seeing it in healthcare. I think I saw something recently that, I think it was as alarming as half of the total healthcare here recently brought down their network because of ransomware. It is a real problem, and I think it comes down to that same strategy of, one, and you heard Dan mention this, critical assets. I need to wall those off. I need to look at segmentation. I need to make sure that, I've been in a customer environment where we were helping them do a discovery and an analysis, and their critical customer environment, there was telnet traffic coming out of that. And that security CISO jumped up, walked out of the room, and immediately went and fixed that problem. They had no clue. So it's having the visibility and the insight to know, hey, there's certain things that should not be happening around my customer database or my customer information, right? And I think that's part of the strategy. And then I gotta be proactive, and I've got to engage in threat hunting. So hearing, the tabletop exercises that Dan mentioned, we do that with customers. Having those proactive approaches and simulations. Some of our partners we work with, we can come in and actually really simulate a full ransomware attack. It allows you to be prepared and understand how to handle that. And one of the things that Dan probably also would mention is you also have to train your team on how to respond, right? How to communicate, how to, hey, we think we have a ransomware attack. Well, wait a minute, we've only got so many hours that we have to, do before we report this out publicly. So before we think, let's validate. And so there's all kinds of things that have to happen. And I see Dan shaking his head because he knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we've had incidents, and then and all the technical tricks were done properly. The communications were horrible.
Yep.
So the lesson learned for us was, okay, the technology is great. Let's work on the communications, guys. Let's get what's the cadence, who's the audience, who needs to be informed, how frequently, all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Can't take that for granted. Yeah.
So
I think it's
as well.
Just to round off it was interesting. Yesterday, just came across my desk was a study from McKinsey showing a chart that basically compared levels of maturity in cybersecurity across sectors. And the fascinating thing was that the variation in the sectors was bigger than it was from sector to sector. In other words, people do know what to do, and there are clearly some leading companies out there that are taking the kinds of measures to be able to limit the impact here. As Dan said earlier, I think we're all in a world where it's not a protected fortress anymore. You have to assume that something bad's going to happen, and it's a question of how do you deal with that. But also it indicated that there's, interestingly enough, the best players in each sector were better than the worst in other sectors, right? Typically, but I think what it says is that if you're in this space, there are plenty of places to go to try to seek out best practices. And I think that's one of the other things that we've seen, whether it's pulling in various companies that are within your ecosystem, whether it's moving out of sector because you're worried about competitive information or not. But one of the things I've seen is just maybe and maybe this is a maturity question, right, is a lack of willingness to necessarily talk about some of these issues or share these issues. And obviously sharing helps everybody in the community. I don't think there's a benefit to any of these cybersecurity issues proliferating for anyone independent of industry. So I would just say, I think, when we think about how can an IT organization prepare more, it's just getting into the right frame of mind to be willing to kind of share, take input from other places. I don't think there's anybody I've talked to that doesn't have some kind of a bad story. And we, rather than kind of put it under the table, I think learning from those things really helps everybody.
That's a huge point in my opinion, because, the adversaries out there, they share information and they share data.
Yep.
And yet we as enterprise environments don't. And the other dynamic you run into that frustrates me, and we could do a whole conversation on this alone, but you also then run into the dynamic at a C-level of, okay, there's a risk analysis, there's a cost analysis, and then you get into, in some places we've seen, and I don't condone this, but it's cheaper for me to just buy like cyber insurance, and oh, now I'm covered at a C-level, which is absolutely not the right way to do it, and false as well. So it's a very interesting topic, and I wholeheartedly agree that I wish more sharing and transparency, and when things happen, I think we should stop pointing fingers at some of these organizations when it happens, and if they're open and transparent and they share the experience and we can all learn from it, we should celebrate that, frankly.
So we know the threat and the challenges are out there. I'd like to get a recommendation from the three of you. I mean, as organizations plan for the evolution and growth of their networks, what advice do you have for their architects and their operations teams? Charlie, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest advice is to be thinking 3 steps ahead. And I know that sounds so easy, but a lot of our recommendations that we get engaged with, we're working with a very large enterprise right now on a complete overhaul and change of their data centers, their remote sites. And the biggest advice we can give them is pick the technologies that allow you to pick up and move, because their direction changes a lot. And looking at things that, for instance, if I'm going to move into the cloud, how easy is it for me to move that if I change in the future to either another provider or maybe to a hosted service? So I hate to think of the word plug and play, but it's really choose the technologies that will allow you to evolve and change at the rate that IT is changing. And the things that would be new and transformative right now, 2 years from now, are going to be the old way of doing it. So our approach is always to try and understand what's your 5-year plan, where could you see this going next, and build that into your design so that you're not creating future issues.
Mark, what advice would you give people?
So I think there are really kind of 3 areas that I'd pick on. The first is obviously all about prioritization. You kind of heard a little bit of that from Dan and Charlie today, but really understanding where the important pieces are. It's probably not practical to be able to secure every single area that you have in a particular business, but there are clearly some areas that are more important than others, and starting there is important. And from that standpoint, there are many techniques around, but really prioritizing, I think, is the first one of those. I think the second thing that you heard from Dan was really all about the people. And pretty much every single circumstance we bump into isn't necessarily a machine issue or a network issue. It stems from a people issue. To be able to break in these days typically takes some kind of information, and whether it's as simple as a phishing scam or something more sophisticated, people are ultimately involved. So educating everybody in the company around the importance of this and how they can help secure the information is really key. And then kind of in my 3 Ps, if you like, the third area is really all around practice. And you've heard from Dan is, these things are probably going to happen. If you've at least pulled the team together, you've gone through the steps, that really helps. And obviously our job is all around testing and monitoring and providing that insight and obviously closing some of these blind spots. But I would tell you that even with the very best of that we've put in place, it is all around the people and the practice that really helps. And the prioritization just balances the cost of being able to secure and respond effectively.
Dan, your key advice for companies?
Wow, it's hard to top Mark's 3 Ps. I love it, Mark. That prioritization, the people, the process. That's awesome. So let me make one tactical piece of advice I would give to architects. and to their CIOs. So architects who are thinking about the next generation network, you're working on what that blueprint looks like. You got to build into your architecture as table stakes some element of monitoring and visibility. It's not good enough to re-architect your network to just the technical components of the network itself. You got to consider the monitoring as an instrumental piece, just as important as the access switches and the core site routers. The monitoring piece has got to be part and parcel to it. And when you do that, your engagement with your CIO, who's going to be trying to squeeze your budget down and say, that's too expensive of a network overhaul. Where can we cut corners? Go to the outcome-based approach. Talk about the outcomes you're trying to achieve, not the specs of the components. Be very outcome focused. And then to the CIOs, my message would be simply listen to your architects, challenge them to be inclusive of not just re-architecting the network for its operational sake, in terms of performance, but for the ongoing running and securing of it through visibility being baked in. Ask for how that is going to be achieved when you see any blueprint put in front of you for that. Challenge it, make sure that that's a key part of the ingredients.
Charlie, Mark, and Dan, I think we covered a lot of good ground. I totally appreciate you sharing your expertise today. I learned something. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.